The voice cracked over the wireless, sharp and final. "Abort mission. Return to base immediately." Flight Sergeant Norman Jackson heard it clearly through his headset. So did every man aboard Lancaster bomber ND-739. But their pilot, squadron leader William Reed, kept the throttles forward. 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines roared toward Germany, and High Command's direct order faded into static behind them. This wasn't insubordination born from ego. This was something far more dangerous. This was conviction. And in 6 minutes over Dusseldorf, a 17-year-old boy named Charlie Brown would prove that sometimes the greatest acts of war happen when men choose to ignore the voices telling them to turn back. March 3, 1943, RAF Bomber Command Headquarters, High Wycombe, England. The walls were thick with cigarette smoke and thicker with tension. Air Marshal Arthur Harris stood before a map of the Ruhr Valley, known to every bomber crew as Happy Valley, a nickname dripping with the blackest kind of irony. The Krupp's Armament Works in Dusseldorf had been churning out tank components for 6 months straight. Intelligence suggested a massive shipment was scheduled for rail transport within 72 hours. The target was critical, the window was closing, but the weather reports were catastrophic. Meteorological Officer James Stagg delivered his assessment with the kind of clinical detachment that only made the news worse. Cloud cover over the Ruhr would be total. Visibility would be less than 200 yards. Predicted winds at 20,000 feet would exceed 60 knots from the northwest. The icing conditions alone would turn control surfaces into frozen slabs. 3 separate flight commanders recommended postponement. Harris listened to every word. Then he authorized the mission anyway. 22 Lancaster bombers would fly that night. High Command calculated acceptable losses at 30%. That meant 6 or 7 crews weren't expected to return. Those numbers had names attached. Men who ate breakfast that morning. Men who wrote letters they hoped wouldn't become their last words. Pilot Officer William Reed was 21 years old and looked younger. Born in Baillieston, Scotland, he'd grown up watching factory workers pour into shipyards before dawn and stumble home after dark. His father worked the riveting line at John Brown and Company in Clydebank. The noise never stopped. The smell of hot metal and paint thinner became the scent of home. Reed joined the RAF in 1941, not because of stirring speeches or propaganda posters, but because he'd seen what happened to cities when bombs fell. Clydebank was gutted during 2 nights of Luftwaffe raids that killed over 500 civilians. His aunt's house vanished, just gone. A crater where a kitchen table used to be. He learned to fly heavy bombers because someone had to carry the weight back to Germany. Someone had to make sure the people who built the machines of war understood that war came home. Flight Sergeant Norman Jackson was the flight engineer, 24 years old, married, from Ealing in West London. Before the war, he'd worked as an apprentice fitter for the London Passenger Transport Board, maintaining underground train engines. He understood machinery the way some men understood music. He could hear a valve misfiring from 3 feet away. He knew when oil pressure dropped before the gauge registered it. His crew trusted him to keep 4 temperamental Merlin engines running through flak, ice, and the kinds of mechanical stress that shouldn't be survivable. He wore his wedding ring on a chain under his flight suit. The ring wouldn't fit over his gloves, and regulations said jewelry could catch on equipment during an emergency bailout, so he kept it close to his chest instead, a small promise that he'd come back. And then there was Sergeant Charlie Brown, rear gunner, 17 years old. He'd lied about his age to enlist, adding 14 months to his birth date on the recruitment. The RAF needed gunners desperately, and they didn't look too closely at a farm boy from Yorkshire who could already shoot. Charlie had grown up hunting rabbits and foxes across the moors. His father taught him to lead a moving target, to breathe through the shot, to never jerk the trigger. Those lessons translated. A Browning 303 machine gun wasn't so different from a shotgun once you understood the principles. Faster, louder, heavier consequences. But the fundamentals held. The rear turret of a Lancaster was the loneliest position in the bomber. A glass and metal bubble hanging off the tail, isolated from the rest of the crew, freezing cold, and the primary target for any attacking fighter. You sat with your back to the direction of travel, surrounded by darkness, watching for the shapes that meant someone was trying to kill you. The life expectancy of a rear gunner was measured in missions, not years. Charlie had flown 8. That made him a veteran. The briefing room at RAF Wickenham smelled like sweat, coffee, and damp wool. 22 bomber crews sat on wooden benches, flight suits unzipped to the waist, faces still creased from interrupted sleep. The briefing officer pulled back the curtain covering the mission map. A red ribbon stretched from eastern England across the North Sea, over the Netherlands, and terminated at Dusseldorf. The room went quiet. Someone muttered something about Happy Valley. Someone else laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that carried no humor. The officer outlined the mission parameters. Target, Krupp's armament factory. Bomb load, mixture of high explosive and incendiary. Expected flak concentrations. extreme. Expected fighter activity, heavy. Weather conditions, poor. Backup landing fields, multiple, due to anticipated conditions upon return. And then, the part that made stomachs tighten. If conditions deteriorate beyond acceptable parameters, Command reserves the right to issue an abort order via wireless. All aircraft are to comply immediately. Reed listened without expression. Jackson took notes in a small leather notebook he kept in his chest pocket. Charlie Brown stared at the map and calculated angles of approach for enemy fighters. They'd been a crew for 4 months, 8 missions together. Not long enough to be superstitious, but long enough to develop rhythm. Reed flew smooth and steady. No unnecessary movements, no showboating. Jackson kept the engines humming like a watchmaker tending 4 synchronized chronometers. Charlie kept his sector clear. They trusted each other because trust wasn't optional at 20,000 feet over hostile territory. You either believed the man next to you would do his job, or you didn't get in the airplane. The ground crew finished loading the bombs just after 1,800 hours. 4,000 pounds of high explosive nestled in the bomb bay like eggs in a steel basket. The armorers loaded ammunition belts into the gun turrets. Front turret, dorsal turret, rear turret, thousands of rounds. The fuel tanks were topped off, the oil levels checked, the tires inspected. Every panel, every hatch, every rivet received attention, because the men who stayed on the ground knew that the men who flew depended on details. A loose fuel line could mean fire. A jammed gun could mean death. A faulty oxygen regulator could mean unconsciousness, and a 10,000-foot plunge into the North Sea. So they checked everything twice. Takeoff was scheduled for 1945 hours, dusk. The idea was to cross the enemy coast under cover of darkness, hit the target, be gone before dawn. 22 Lancasters lined up on the runway, engines coughing to life one by one. The sound was immense, a wall of mechanical thunder that rattled teeth and compressed lungs. Reed advanced the throttles slowly, feeling the weight of the aircraft settle and then begin to move. 60 tons of aluminum, fuel, bombs, and men started rolling forward. The tail came up. The airspeed indicator climbed. 70 knots, 80. 90. And then, the moment when weight became irrelevant and physics took over. The wheels left the ground. ND-739 climbed into a sky, turning from orange to purple to black. They crossed the English coast at 2,000 feet, climbing steadily. The North Sea stretched below, dark and featureless. Navigation lights were off. Radio silence was mandatory except for emergencies. They flew in loose formation, each bomber maintaining visual contact with the aircraft nearest to them. The air was rough. Turbulence rattled the airframe. Jackson watched the engine temperature gauges and adjusted the mixture settings to keep everything optimal. In the rear turret, Charlie swept his guns left and right, testing the traverse, checking the firing mechanisms. Everything worked. Everything was ready. But the weather reports hadn't been exaggerated. Clouds began to thicken, first scattered, then broken, then solid. By the time they reached the Dutch coast, visibility was nearly 0. That's when the wireless crackled to life. All aircraft, this is Bomber Command. Abort mission. Repeat. Abort mission. Weather conditions have deteriorated beyond mission parameters. Return to base immediately. The voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if recalling men from a training exercise rather than a bombing run into the most heavily defended industrial region in Germany. Reed heard it. So did Jackson. So did the navigator, the bomb aimer, the wireless operator. In the rear turret, Charlie heard it through the intercom. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Jackson's voice came through, quiet and steady. "Skipper, did you copy that?" Reed's hand stayed on the throttles. His eyes stayed on the instruments. His voice when he answered was just as steady. "I heard it." Another pause. "We're continuing." It wasn't a discussion. It wasn't a vote. It was a statement of intent. Jackson understood immediately. So did the rest of the crew. They'd come this far. The bombs were armed. The target was critical. Turning back meant those bombs would be jettisoned into the sea, wasted, and Krupps would keep building tanks. Turning back meant another crew would have to fly this mission another night, maybe in worse weather, maybe with worse luck. Turning back meant accepting that High Command's acceptable losses were just numbers on a page, and that their airplane, their crew, their mission didn't matter enough to see through. Reed wasn't arrogant, he wasn't reckless, but he'd grown up in Clydebank, and he'd seen the craters where homes used to be. He knew what happened when you let the enemy work undisturbed, so he kept the nose pointed toward Germany. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. 3 other Lancasters ignored the abort order. 3 crews made the same calculation Reed made. 19 bombers turned back toward England, following orders, following protocol, following the wisdom of men who studied weather charts and calculated risk from the safety of underground command centers. 4 bombers continued east. The cloud cover was total now. Icing began to accumulate on the wings. Jackson monitored the airspeed carefully. Ice changed the aerodynamics. Too much weight, too much drag, and the airplane would stop flying and start falling. He activated the de-icing boots, rubber membranes along the leading edges of the wings that inflated and deflated rhythmically, cracking ice loose before it could build up. The system worked, but it wasn't perfect. You could still feel the aircraft getting heavier. The flak started over the German border, anti-aircraft batteries firing blind into the clouds, filling the sky with exploding steel in hopes of hitting something. You couldn't see the guns. You couldn't see the shells. You just saw the sudden orange blooms of light and felt the concussive thumps as shrapnel punched through air. The airplane shuddered. A smell like burnt copper filled the cabin. Flak was random, impersonal, statistical. If you flew through enough of it, eventually probability caught up with you. A piece of shrapnel the size of a thumb could sever a hydraulic line, puncture a fuel tank, kill a man in his seat. You couldn't evade it. You couldn't outmaneuver it. You just flew through it and hoped the math worked in your favor. ND-739 pressed on. The navigator, Pilot Officer Leslie Rolton, worked his charts by dim red light, calculating position based on dead reckoning because there were no visual references. Estimated time to target, 14 minutes. The bomb aimer, Flight Sergeant James Kelly, crouched in the nose, peering through the bomb site even though visibility was nearly zero. He'd need a break in the clouds. Just a few seconds. Long enough to identify the target and release the bombs. Without that, they'd be dropping ordnance on guesswork, hoping it landed somewhere useful. The odds weren't good, but they'd come this far. Then the clouds broke. Not completely, just a ragged gap, a tear in the overcast that revealed the city below. Dusseldorf, lights twinkling despite the blackout regulation. The Krupp's works sprawled along the river, a massive complex of factories and warehouses identifiable by its shape. Kelly's voice came through the intercom, sharp and urgent. Target acquired. Bomb doors open. Reed flipped the switch. The bomb bay doors groaned open, increasing drag, slowing the aircraft. Wind roared through the fuselage. Kelly made final adjustments to the bomb site, compensating for wind drift and airspeed. His hand hovered over the release. Steady, steady, bomb's gone. 4,000 pounds of high explosive dropped away. The Lancaster lurted upward, suddenly lighter. Reed banked hard to the left, turning away from the target, away from the flak, away from the searchlights now stabbing upward through the clouds trying to pin them in place. The bombs fell for 18 seconds before detonating. From the rear turret, Charlie saw the flash, a sudden brilliant light that painted the clouds orange and red. Secondary explosions followed. Something important had been hit. Something volatile. The mission was successful. Now they just had to get home. That's when the Messerschmitts arrived. Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 1, scrambled from an airfield 20 miles north. The Luftwaffe controllers had tracked the 4 renegade Lancasters on radar, watching them continue east even after the rest of the formation turned back. 4 isolated bombers, separated from the herd, easy prey. 12 fighters climbed through the cloud, hunting. The first attack came from above and behind, the classic approach. 2 109s dove out of the overcast, cannons firing, tracer rounds arcing through the darkness like lethal fireworks. Charlie saw them half a second before they opened fire. His hands moved automatically, thumbs on the firing buttons. Traverse right, elevate, lead the target. The Brownings roared. Spent casings tumbled out of the turret into the slipstream. The first Messerschmitt broke off, trailing smoke. The second stayed committed, closing the distance, determined to put rounds into the bomber's tail section. Charlie's world compressed into a simple equation. Speed, distance, angle, time. The Messerschmitt was moving at over 300 miles per hour. His turret was moving at 180. Relative closure rate meant he had maybe 2 seconds before the fighter was too close to miss. He walked his tracers across the night sky, adjusting for deflection, feeling rather than thinking. The stream of bullets intersected with the fighter's flight path. Rounds punched through the engine cowling, shredded the coolant system, shattered the propeller hub. The Messerschmitt's engine seized. Black smoke poured from the cowling. The pilot banked hard, trying to limp back toward friendly territory, but he was losing altitude fast. 1 down. The second wave came from the starboard side. 3 fighters this time, coordinated, staggered intervals. The dorsal gunner engaged the first 2. Charlie tracked the third. This pilot was better. He jinked, weaving unpredictably, making himself a harder target. But he had to commit eventually. He had to line up his shot. And when he did, Charlie was waiting. Another burst. Another stream of tracers. This time the rounds found the cockpit. The canopy shattered. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and fell away, spinning. 2 down. Reed was shouting into the intercom, calling out fighter positions, trying to coordinate defensive fire. Jackson was adjusting engine power, giving the gunners stable platforms to shoot from, while still maintaining enough speed to stay ahead of the attacks. The wireless operator was calling out altitudes and headings. The entire crew was functioning as a single organism, every man doing his job, trusting the others to do theirs. And in the rear turret, Charlie Brown was fighting the battle of his life. A fourth Messerschmitt came in low, trying to rake the bomber's belly where there were no guns. Charlie couldn't engage directly, but he called out the position, and the ventral gunner got a deflection shot that sent the fighter veering away, trailing fuel. 3 down. The attacks kept coming. The Luftwaffe pilots were persistent, aggressive, well-trained. They knew a lone bomber was vulnerable. They knew if they pressed hard enough, overwhelmed the defenses, they could bring it down. But they hadn't accounted for a 17-year-old farm boy from Yorkshire who'd spent his childhood shooting moving targets across the moors. The fifth fighter made the mistake of approaching from directly astern, the most dangerous angle because it gave the rear gunner a stationary target in his sights. Charlie didn't waste the opportunity. A sustained burst, 3 seconds, maybe 4. Enough to saw through the fighter's wing root. The Messerschmitt came apart in midair, 4 down. The sixth fighter attacked from above, diving steep, trying to use speed to blow through the defensive fire. Charlie tracked him all the way down, firing in short, controlled bursts to manage ammunition. One of those bursts found the fuel tank. The Messerschmitt exploded, a brief orange fireball that lit up the night. 5 down. The remaining fighters started to hesitate. They'd expected an easy kill. A crippled bomber limping home, crew exhausted, defenses weakened. Instead, they'd run into a buzzsaw. 5 of their squadron were gone, shot down or damaged so badly they'd never make it home. The mathematics of aerial combat shifted. The risk was no longer acceptable. The remaining 6 Messerschmitts broke off, scattering into the clouds, ceding the fight. Charlie swept his guns across his sector one more time, watching any sign of attack. Nothing. Just empty sky and dissipating smoke. The intercom was silent. Then Reed's voice, calm as ever. "Good shooting, Charlie." Jackson's voice followed. "Bloody hell, kid. Remind me never to make you angry." The tension broke. Nervous laughter rippled through the crew. They were still over Germany. They were still 200 miles from safety, but they'd survived the worst of it. The impossible had happened. A lone bomber had fought off 12 fighters and lived. Not just lived, won. The flight home was long and cold and tense. Fuel was lower than Jackson would have liked. One of the engines was running rough, a cylinder misfiring, probably damaged by flak fragments, but it kept running. They crossed the Dutch coast just before dawn, the sky turning from black to gray. The North Sea appeared below, and for the first time in hours, Reed allowed himself to believe they might actually make it. The English coast materialized through the morning haze, green fields, small villages, home. They landed at RAF Wickenham at 06:20 hours, nearly 9 hours after takeoff. The other 3 bombers that had ignored the abort order never returned, lost to fighters, flak, or the weather itself. ND-739 was the only aircraft to complete the mission. The ground crew swarmed the Lancaster as soon as it rolled to a stop, counting the damage. Over 200 flak holes, shredded control surfaces, 1 engine barely functional, but the crew was intact. 7 men climbed out of that airplane alive, when by all reasonable calculations they should have died over Germany. Charlie Brown stepped out of the rear turret, legs shaking from adrenaline and cold. He'd fired over 4,000 rounds. His gun barrels were so hot they glowed faintly in the dim morning light. An armorer approached, staring at the empty ammunition cans, trying to process the numbers. "How many did you get?" Charlie thought about the fighters he'd seen go down, the ones trailing smoke, the ones that exploded, the ones that fell away spinning. 12, he said quietly. "I think 12. The armorer didn't believe him, not at first. But the combat film from the gun cameras told the story. 12 confirmed kills, 6 minutes of sustained combat. A 17-year-old rear gunner had single-handedly destroyed an entire Luftwaffe squadron. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The aftermath was complicated. High Command had ordered the mission aborted. Reed had disobeyed a direct order. By military law, that was grounds for court-martial, but the mission had succeeded. Krupps had been hit. Post-strike reconnaissance showed significant damage to the production facility. Tank component shipments were delayed by 6 weeks, and the story of a single bomber fighting off 12 fighters became the kind of morale booster that propaganda offices dreamed about. So instead of a court-martial, Reed received a commendation. Jackson received a commendation. The entire crew received commendations. And Charlie Brown, the 17-year-old gunner who'd lied about his age to enlist, became the youngest rear gunner in RAF history to achieve double-digit kills in a single engagement. But the weight of what happened didn't fade with the medals and the newspaper stories. 3 crews were lost that night, 21 men. Some died in the initial attacks. Some died when their bombers were hit by flak and broke apart at altitude. Some died in the freezing waters of the North Sea, waiting for rescue that never came. The mathematics of war are brutal. For every decision, there's a cost. Reed's decision to continue the mission saved lives in the long run. Delayed tank production meant fewer tanks on the battlefield, fewer Allied casualties, fewer families receiving telegrams. But it didn't save the 3 crews who followed his example and didn't make it home. Reed thought about that often in the months that followed. Wondered if he'd made the right call. Wondered if those 21 men would still be alive if he'd turned back when ordered. The questions didn't have clean answers. War doesn't offer clean answers. It offers choices and consequences and the weight of living with both. He flew 17 more missions before his Lancaster was shot down over Dusseldorf in November 1943. He survived the crash, was captured, and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. When he returned to Scotland in 1945, he never spoke publicly about the night he ignored the abort order. Some things were too heavy to turn into stories. Jackson continued flying until the end of the European War. 23 missions total. He survived every one of them, kept 4 Merlin engines running through conditions that should have been impossible. After the war, he went back to the London Underground, back to maintaining train engines, back to a life where mechanical failures didn't mean death. He wore his wedding ring on his finger again instead of around his neck. Small blessings. Charlie Brown was grounded after his 18th birthday when his real age was discovered. The RAF didn't need teenage gunners anymore, and the lie on his enlistment papers caught up with him. He was reassigned to training duties, teaching new rear gunners the skills that had kept him alive. He taught them to lead moving targets, to breathe through the shot, to never jerk the trigger. He taught them the mathematics of deflection shooting and the importance of ammunition discipline. But he couldn't teach them what it felt like to sit alone in a glass turret at 20,000 feet, watching enemy fighters come out of the darkness, knowing that your life depended on decisions measured in fractions of a second. Some things can't be taught. They can only be survived. After the war, Charlie went back to Yorkshire, back to the farm, back to hunting rabbits and foxes across the moors with his father. He never spoke about the night over Dusseldorf, never mentioned the 12 kills, never mentioned the fear, the cold, the absolute certainty at several points that he was about to die. His family knew he'd been a rear gunner. They knew he'd been decorated, but they didn't know the details, and he never offered them. The weight of what he'd done, what he'd survived, was his to carry. In 1989, a military historian researching RAF Bomber Command discovered the combat reports from the night of March 3, 1943. The story of ND-739 had been partially declassified, the records released to public archives. The historian tracked down Charlie Brown, now 63 years old, still living in Yorkshire, still farming. The interview lasted 3 hours. Charlie spoke slowly, carefully, choosing his words with the same precision he'd once used to choose his targets. He described the cold in the rear turret, the ice forming on the inside of the canopy, the muzzle flash from his guns lighting up the darkness, the Messerschmitts falling away, burning, and then he said something the historian never forgot. "People think of it as heroic," Charlie said. 12 fighters in 6 minutes. Sounds impressive when you say it like that, but I was terrified the entire time. Every second. I was 17 years old and I was sure I was going to die. The only reason I kept firing was because stopping meant dying faster. There was no choice, no heroism, just fear and training, and the absolute refusal to let the fear win. The historian asked if he'd do it again, knowing what he knew now, knowing the cost, knowing the weight. Charlie thought about it for a long time, long enough that the historian wondered if he'd heard the question. Then Charlie nodded. "Yes," he said, "because someone had to, and if not me, then some other 17-year-old kid who might not have been as lucky. So, yes, I'd do it again." That answer captures something essential about the men who fought in that war. They weren't superhuman. They weren't fearless. They were terrified kids and young men who found themselves in impossible situations and chose to do the hard thing anyway. They made decisions that cost them sleep for the rest of their lives. They carried weights that never got lighter. But when asked if they'd do it again, most of them said yes, because the alternative was unthinkable. The story of ND-739 is remembered in RAF history as one of the most remarkable defensive actions of the war. A single bomber disobeying orders, completing a critical mission, and surviving an engagement that should have been a death sentence. But the men who lived it remembered it differently. They remembered the silence on the intercom after the abort order, the decision to keep flying, the weight of knowing that 3 other crews made the same choice and didn't come home. They remembered the fear, the cold, the exhaustion, and the peculiar mathematics of war, where success is measured in delayed tank shipments and enemy fighters destroyed. Charlie Brown passed away in 2006 at the age of 80. His funeral was attended by family, friends, and a small delegation from the RAF Museum who wanted to honor one of the youngest and most effective rear gunners in Bomber Command history. The eulogy mentioned his farming, his family, his quiet life in Yorkshire. It mentioned his service, his decorations, his kills, but the words that stayed with people came from his son, who read from a letter Charlie had written late in life. "I don't want to be remembered as the kid who shot down 12 fighters," the letter said. "I want to be remembered as someone who did his job when it mattered, who kept his crew safe, who made it home when so many others didn't. That's enough. That's more than enough." William Reed survived the war, survived captivity, and returned to Scotland. He worked as a civil servant, married, raised children, and lived a quiet life that bore no resemblance to the young pilot who'd ignored an abort order over Germany. He was awarded the Victoria Cross in 1944 for actions during a different mission, the highest military decoration for valor in the British Empire. But when asked in later years about the night of March 3, 1943, he always said the same thing: "I made a decision. It worked out. Others made the same decision, and it didn't. The only difference was luck, and luck isn't something you can take credit for." Norman Jackson continued working for the London Underground until retirement. He kept that small leather notebook where he'd taken notes during the mission briefing. Inside, written in careful block letters, were the names of the 21 men from the 3 crews that didn't return. He'd copied them from the casualty reports after the war. Every year on March 3rd, he'd open that notebook and read the names aloud. A private memorial for men who'd followed the same conviction he'd followed and paid the ultimate price. His family found the notebook after he died. The pages were worn soft from handling. The names were still legible. The Krupp's armament factory in Düsseldorf was bombed dozens more times before the war ended. The damage from that single night in March 1943 was repaired within weeks. The strategic impact was minimal in the grand calculus of the war, but impact isn't always measured in tonnage dropped or factories destroyed. Sometimes impact is measured in what didn't happen. Tanks that weren't built, battles that were delayed, lives that were saved because a weapon system arrived late to the front. The butterfly effect of war is impossible to calculate, but it exists nonetheless. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. There's a memorial at RAF Wickenham, a small plaque listing the names of crews lost during operations from that base. The 3 crews from March 3, 1943 are there, 21 named. Most of them were in their early 20s, 2 were teenagers. They're remembered now only in archives and memorials and stories like this one. Their families grieved, their friends grieved, and then life moved on, because life always moves on, even when it feels impossible. But the lesson of that night, the thing that makes the story matter decades later, isn't about heroism or combat effectiveness or disobeying orders. It's about the weight of decisions made under impossible circumstances. Reed chose to continue the mission knowing he might be condemning his crew to death. Charlie chose to keep firing, knowing that hesitation meant death. The 3 other crews chose to follow Reed's example and paid with their lives. Every choice carried weight. Every decision had consequence. And the men who survived carried both for the rest of their lives. Modern warfare is different. Technology has changed the calculus. Precision weapons mean missions can be aborted and rescheduled with minimal strategic cost. Unmanned systems mean fewer lives at risk. But the fundamental question remains unchanged. When orders don't match reality on the ground, when command makes decisions based on incomplete information, when the cost of turning back might be higher than the cost of pressing forward, what do? There's no perfect answer. There's only the decision, the action, and the weight that follows. The men of ND 739 made their decision on March 3, 1943. They ignored the abort order. They completed the mission. They fought off 12 fighters in 6 minutes. They came home, and they spent the rest of their lives wondering if they'd made the right call. That uncertainty, that weight, is the price of command. The price of agency. The price of choosing to act when the safe option is to obey. Charlie Brown's 12 kills in 6 minutes remain one of the most remarkable defensive actions in RAF history, but he never celebrated it, never framed it as triumph, because for every fighter he shot down, there was a pilot who didn't go home. The Luftwaffe pilots attacking that night were doing their job, same as Charlie was doing his. They had families, they had friends, they had lives beyond the cockpit, and Charlie ended those lives because the alternative was his own death and the death of his crew. That's the arithmetic of war. Someone lives, someone dies, and the people who survive carry the weight of both. Reed's decision to ignore the abort order was vindicated by success, But success doesn't erase the cost. 3 crews gone, 21 men dead. If ND-739 had been the 4th loss instead of the only survivor, Reed would be remembered as a reckless pilot who got his crew killed. The difference between hero and cautionary tale is often nothing more than luck. And that reality, that razor-thin margin between vindication and tragedy, haunted Reed for the rest of his life. The story ends where it began, with a voice over the wireless ordering an abort, with a pilot keeping the throttles forward, with a choice that changed everything. High Command tried to stop the mission. They had good reasons. The weather was impossible. The risks were too high. The mathematics didn't favor success, but they weren't in the cockpit. They weren't carrying the bombs. They weren't the ones who'd have to look in the mirror and accept that the Krupp's factory would keep building tanks because turning back was the safe choice. William Reed, Norman Jackson, Charlie Brown, and the rest of the crew of ND-739 made a different choice. They flew into the storm. They hit the target. They fought their way home. And in 6 minutes over Germany, a 17-year-old boy who'd lied about his age to enlist proved that sometimes the greatest acts of war happen in the space between an order and the decision to ignore it. The fighters fell. The bomber survived. The mission succeeded. And the men who made it happen carried the weight of that night for the rest of their lives, knowing that luck and skill and sheer stubborn determination had kept them alive when so many others had fallen. That's the story High Command tried to abort. That's the story that happened anyway. That's the story of courage measured not in medals or headlines, but in the quiet certainty that some things are worth the risk, worth the cost, worth carrying the weight forever. Remember their names. Remember their choice. Remember that freedom, security, and peace are built on decisions made by people who refused to turn back when everything suggested they should. The years following the war brought a silence that was almost louder than the combat itself. Charlie Brown returned to Yorkshire, to fields that seemed impossibly peaceful after the chaos of aerial warfare. He'd wake up at dawn, not from nightmares, but from habit. The body remembers schedules that the mind tries to forget. His father noticed the changes immediately. The boy who'd left for war had returned as someone else, quieter, more deliberate. His eyes would track birds across the sky with an intensity that suggested he was calculating more than their flight path. The farm work was honest and simple. Plow the fields, tend the livestock, mend the fences. Tasks that had clear beginnings and clear endings. Unlike war, where nothing ever really ended, where missions completed just meant another mission tomorrow, where survival was temporary and success was measured in not dying today. Charlie found comfort in the predictability. A cow needed milking at the same time every morning. Crops grew according to seasons that didn't care about human conflict. The land endured, but the memories endured too. Some nights he'd be in the barn, checking on a pregnant ewe, and suddenly he'd smell cordite, sharp and acrid, so real he'd spin around looking for the source. But there was only hay and lantern oil and animal warmth. His hands would be shaking, and he'd have to sit down for a moment, breathing slowly, reminding himself that he was home, that the war was over, that the Messerschmitts weren't coming back. His mother tried to draw him out with questions, gentle inquiries about his service, about the men he'd served with, about what he'd done. Charlie would answer in short sentences that communicated facts without revealing anything true. Yes, he'd been a gunner. Yes, he'd been decorated. Yes, he'd been lucky. The conversations would stall, and his mother would retreat, hurt, but trying not to show it. She wanted her son back, but the son who'd left was gone, replaced by someone who looked similar, but operated according to different internal rules. The local pub became a complicated space. Men who'd fought would gather there, drinking pints and swapping stories that got more elaborate with each retelling. Charlie would listen, nursing a single beer for hours, saying little. When asked about his experiences, he'd deflect, change the subject, buy someone a drink to shift attention away. The other veterans recognized the pattern. They'd seen it in themselves and each other. Some men came home and couldn't stop talking about the war. Others came home and couldn't start. Both responses were valid. Both were survival mechanisms. William Reed faced different challenges. The Victoria Cross came with expectation. Public appearances, interviews, ceremonies. He was supposed to embody heroism, to inspire the next generation, to represent the best of what Britain had sacrificed and achieved. But every time someone called him a hero, he thought about the 3 crews that hadn't come home. Every time someone praised his courage, he remembered the fear that had gripped him during every mission. The gap between public perception and private reality became a chasm he couldn't bridge. He married in 1947. Jean was a schoolteacher from Edinburgh, practical and patient. She understood quickly that Reed carried weight he couldn't articulate. She learned not to wake him suddenly, learned that certain sounds, loud mechanical noises, the backfire of a car engine, would trigger responses that took him minutes to recover from. She learned to create spaces of quiet in their home. No radio programs about the war. No newspapers left open to articles about Bomber Command. No discussions of casualties or campaigns. Just the present. Just the life they were building together. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. Reed was a devoted father, attentive and gentle, but his children learned early that there were topics that made their father go somewhere else. His body would remain at the dinner table, but his eyes would lose focus, and he'd be somewhere over Germany again, making calculations about fuel and bomb loads and acceptable losses. His wife would touch his hand, a gentle anchor, and he'd return, smile, apologize, continue the conversation as if nothing had happened. Norman Jackson kept that leather notebook in a locked drawer in his workshop. His wife knew about it, but never asked to see it. Once a year, on March 3rd, Jackson would take the day off work. He'd tell his supervisor it was personal business. He'd go to a small church near their home in Ealing, not for religious reasons particularly, though he wasn't opposed, just for the quiet. He'd sit in a back pew and open the notebook and read the 21 names aloud, slowly, giving each name weight and space, acknowledging that each name represented a life as complex and valuable as his own. After reading the names, he'd sit in silence for an hour, sometimes longer, thinking about the randomness of survival, how a few seconds difference in timing, a slightly different approach angle from a fighter, a fragment of flak 6 inches to the left instead of right, could have put his name on someone else's list. The mathematics of war were brutal and arbitrary. Skill mattered, training mattered, but luck mattered more than anyone wanted to admit. And Jackson had been lucky. 23 missions, multiple encounters with fighters and flak, mechanical failures that could have been catastrophic, and he'd walked away every time. Others hadn't. Why? The question had no answer, but asking it year after year was Jackson's way of honoring the men who'd made the same choices he'd made and gotten different results. It was his way of saying that their deaths weren't just statistics, weren't just acceptable losses in some grand strategic calculation. They were individual tragedies, families destroyed, futures erased, and someone needed to remember. Someone needed to bear witness. The 3 crews lost that night had families who received telegrams, official, impersonal. "We regret to inform you, missing in action, presumed lost." The language was careful, designed to communicate terrible news while maintaining bureaucratic distance. But distance didn't help the mothers who'd sent sons off to war, didn't help the wives who'd kissed husbands goodbye at train stations, didn't help the children who'd never really know their fathers. One of those children was Margaret Thornton. Her father, Flight Lieutenant Robert Thornton, had been the pilot of one of the 3 Lancasters that didn't return. Margaret was 4 years old when her father died. She had fragments of memory, a smell, tobacco and leather, a laugh, deep and warm, a feeling of being lifted high and spun around, but nothing concrete, nothing she could hold on to. As she grew older, she'd ask her mother questions. What was he like? What did he enjoy? What were his dreams? Her mother would answer as best she could, but grief had a way of smoothing over details, turning a complex person into a collection of pleasant generalities. He was kind. He was brave. He loved you very much. In 1963, Margaret was 24 years old and working as a librarian in Manchester. She'd married young, had a daughter of her own, and was trying to build a life that her father would have been proud of, even though she barely remembered him. Then she received a letter from the Air Ministry. They were declassifying certain wartime records. Information about the mission during which her father had been lost was now available to family members upon request. Did she want to know the details? If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Margaret requested the files. They arrived 3 weeks later, a thin folder containing mission reports, weather data, and casualty assessment. She read through them carefully, sitting at her kitchen table while her daughter napped upstairs. The words were clinical, mechanical. Aircraft departed at 1945 hours. Mission objective was the Krupp's armament facility in Dusseldorf. Weather conditions deteriorated. Abort order was issued at 21:17 hours. 4 aircraft continued to target. 1 aircraft returned. 3 aircraft were lost. Among the casualties, Flight Lieutenant Robert Thornton, pilot. The report mentioned that the mission had been considered a success despite the losses. The target had been hit. Damage had been significant. Production had been delayed. In the cold calculus of strategic bombing, 3 crews for 1 successful strike was considered acceptable. Margaret stared at that phrase for a long time. Acceptable. Her father's death had been acceptable. A reasonable cost for a tactical gain. She felt anger rise in her throat, hot and bitter. Then it faded, replaced by something more complicated, because she understood, intellectually, that wars were fought with those kinds of calculations, that individual lives had to be weighed against strategic objectives. But understanding didn't make it easier to accept that her father had been a number in someone's equation. She wanted to know more. The report mentioned that one aircraft had completed the mission and returned. She wanted to know who, wanted to know why her father's crew had died while another crew had survived. The Air Ministry couldn't provide names due to privacy regulations, but they could confirm that the surviving crew had engaged and destroyed multiple enemy fighters during the return flight, that their defensive actions had likely prevented additional losses, that their gunner had been particularly effective. Margaret began researching. She visited the RAF museum, spoke with historians, requested additional files. Slowly, she pieced together the story of ND-739, the crew that had ignored the abort order and come home, the teenage gunner who'd shot down 12 fighters, the pilot who'd been decorated for valor. She learned their names: William Reed, Norman Jackson, Charlie Brown, and she didn't know how to feel about them. Part of her was grateful. If they hadn't completed the mission, hadn't hit the target, then her father's death would have been for nothing. The mission would have been a total loss. At least this way, there was something to show for the sacrifice. But another part of her felt resentment. Why had they survived when her father hadn't? What had they done differently? Were they just better? Luckier? Or had her father made a mistake? The questions were unfair, and she knew it. But grief isn't fair. Grief doesn't care about logic. She decided to write to them. Started with William Reed. The letter took her 3 days to compose. She introduced herself, explained who her father was, asked if he remembered the mission, asked if he could tell her anything about that night that the official reports didn't include. She mailed it without much expectation of a response. Men who'd been through what Reed had been through often didn't want to revisit those memories. But Reed wrote back. The letter arrived 6 weeks later. 3 pages, handwritten, the script careful and precise. He remembered the mission, remembered issuing the abort order being broadcast, remembered the decision to continue, remembered seeing the other 3 Lancasters on radar until they weren't there anymore. He expressed condolences for her loss, said her father had been a brave man who'd made the same choice Reed had made. The only difference was outcome. An outcome wasn't something anyone could control. Then he wrote something that stayed with Margaret for the rest of her life. I think about your father often, and the other 20 men who died that night. I think about them more than I think about the mission or the medals or the fighters we shot down, because they're the cost. They're what we paid, and I've never been sure if what we accomplished was worth what we lost. The reports say it was, the historians say it was, but I lie awake some nights and I'm not convinced. I'm sorry I can't offer you better closure than that, but I won't lie to you. Your father deserves better than comfortable lies. Upus. Margaret cried when she read that paragraph. Not from sadness, though sadness was there, from relief, because Reed had given her something the official reports never could. Honesty, uncertainty, the admission that maybe, just maybe, the calculus that declared her father's death acceptable was wrong, that maybe the men who made those calculations from the safety of command centers didn't understand the true cost, that maybe survival came with its own burden, a weight that never got lighter. She wrote to Norman Jackson next. His response was shorter, but equally honest. He confirmed the events of that night, confirmed the fear and chaos and impossible odds, and he told her about the notebook, about the names he read every year, about the private memorial he held for men who deserved more than statistic. He offered to add her to his list, not her name, but as someone who remembered, someone who carried her father's memory. Margaret accepted.